The room smelled like gardenias and old money. 400 people in black tie, crystal catching the light from chandeliers that cost more than my grandmother's house in Tucson, and I was standing at a microphone that wasn't meant for me. Behind me, projected on a 12-foot screen that Whitney Pemberton had rented for her wedding slideshow, were 18 months of falsified insurance claims. $1.8 million in staged property damage across 3 vacation homes. Photographs of furniture that had been deliberately aged with sandpaper and tea stains. Spreadsheets with dates and dollar amounts highlighted in yellow. And every single person in that ballroom had stopped breathing at the same exact moment. I could see Harrison Pemberton III at the head table, reaching for a glass of scotch that he had already finished. His hand closed around nothing. His wife Margaret sat beside him with her mouth slightly open, the way it looked when she was about to correct someone's pronunciation, except no sound was coming out. And my husband Bennett, the man I had married 4 years ago in a ceremony his mother called charming in a rustic sort of way, was staring at me like he had never seen me before. He was right. He never had. But I need to go back. I need to tell you how a girl from Tucson ended up standing at that microphone, and why every word I said into it was a debt I owed to a woman who never asked anyone for anything except to be treated like a human being. My grandmother, Lucia Delgado, crossed the border from Guadalajara when she was 19 years old, carrying 2 things: her mother's sewing kit in a worn leather case, and the belief that if your hands could make beautiful things, you would always have a place in this world. She was right about the first part. She built a life with those hands. She altered dresses for half the wealthy families in Scottsdale and Phoenix, and the Pembertons were her longest clients. 30 years she worked for them. She altered Margaret Pemberton's wedding dress in 1974, turned it from a department store gown into something that looked like it came from Paris. She did it for free, because Margaret said she couldn't afford alterations after the cost of the venue. 30 years of taking in hems and letting out waistbands and repairing the seams on clothes that cost more than her monthly rent. And not once, not a single time, was Abuela Lucia invited to sit at their table. She was always the woman in the back room with pins in her mouth. The woman who entered through the service entrance. The woman whose hands touched their most intimate garments but whose presence at their dinner parties was unthinkable. I grew up watching this. I grew up watching my grandmother press her best dress before driving to the Pemberton estate, and I grew up watching her come home with a check that was always a little less than what was promised, because Margaret had decided the work wasn't quite what she'd envisioned. I became an insurance fraud investigator because I wanted to spend my life catching people who took what didn't belong to them. I never imagined I would marry into a family that would become the biggest case of my career. Bennett Pemberton Shaw was charming. I need to say that clearly because you need to understand the trap. He was the kind of man who remembered your coffee order and asked about your mother's health, and held doors open with a smile that made you feel like the most important person in whatever room you were standing in. When he pursued me, it felt like being chosen. When he introduced me to his family, he held my hand and said, "This is Carmen, and she's the best thing that's ever happened to me." Margaret smiled. Harrison shook my hand. Whitney, Bennett's sister, complimented my earrings. It felt warm. It felt like a rival. The first time I saw the other face was 3 months after our wedding. We were hanging photos in the hallway of our new home, and I had framed 2 pictures from my quinceañera alongside our wedding portraits. The soft pink of my dress, the papel picado in the background, my grandmother's hands adjusting my tiara. Bennett stared at them for a long moment and said nothing. 2 weeks later, I found all our wedding photos moved to the basement. When I asked why, Bennett said his mother had visited and suggested the gallery wall needed a more cohesive aesthetic. I found my quinceañera pictures in a box in the garage. When I confronted him, he said, and I want you to hear the exact words because I have never forgotten them, he said, Mom just thinks some images are a little too ethnic for the main floor, babe. It's not personal. It's design. Too ethnic. My face. My grandmother's hands. My family's celebration of my womanhood. Too ethnic for the wall of a house I paid half the mortgage on. I put the photos back. He moved them again while I was at work. I put them back a second time and told him if they moved again, I would be the thing that moved out. They stayed. But something between us cracked that day, and it never healed. It just got painted over. The Pembertons' 50th anniversary party was supposed to be a celebration. My grandmother traveled from Tucson at Margaret's personal invitation. We simply must have Lucia there, Margaret had said on the phone, her voice dripping with the kind of warmth that convinces you the sun is shining even when it's raining. She's practically family. Abuela Lucia arrived in her best dress, the navy blue one with the lace collar she had sewn herself, carrying a gift she had spent 2 weeks choosing, a hand-embroidered tablecloth she had started the month my grandfather died and finished the week the invitation came. She walked into the Pemberton estate with her leather sewing kit in her purse because she never went anywhere without it, the way a doctor carries a stethoscope or a priest carries a Bible. It was her identity compressed into a 12-inch case with a brass clasp. Inside, it was the same thimble she had used to alter Margaret's wedding dress 50 years earlier. And within 20 minutes of arriving, Margaret Pemberton walked up to my 78-year-old grandmother and handed her a tray of bruschetta. "Lucia, darling, we're short a server and you're so wonderful with people. Would you mind terribly? Just for the first hour." I watched my grandmother's face. I watched the light in her eyes change. Not dim, exactly. Something worse. Something that looked like recognition. Like she had been waiting her whole life for this family to confirm what she had always feared they believed about her. She took the tray. She took it because she was raised to be gracious, because she believed that saying no to a request in someone else's home was a kind of cruelty. Because 78 years of being a brown woman in America had taught her that refusal has consequences that accommodation does not. I watched her walk through that party with bruschetta on a silver tray, smiling at people who assumed she was hired help, while Margaret's own mother's portrait hung over the fireplace in a gilded frame. 2 women. Both had worked with their hands their whole lives. One was on the wall. One was carrying the appetizers. If anyone ever handed your grandmother a serving tray at a party she was invited to as a guest, I need you to understand something. Your grandmother was the gift they didn't deserve. She walked into that room carrying more dignity than every crystal glass on every table in that house combined, and they looked at her hands and saw a servant. Have you ever watched someone you love be treated as less than? I want to hear your story in the comments, because you carry that moment in your body. I know because I still carry mine. I found my grandmother in the garden afterward, sitting on a stone bench with the sewing kit in her lap, running her thumb over the leather. She was not crying. She was doing something worse than crying. She was quiet in the way people get when they have finished being surprised by cruelty. Roberto Vega found her there before I did. Roberto had been the Pemberton estate manager for 22 years. He had watched my grandmother alter Margaret's wedding dress in 1974, watched her work through the night to get it right, watched Margaret wear it down the aisle without a single word of thanks. He was standing beside Abuela Lucia when I came around the hedge, and he was saying something quietly that stopped me in my tracks. "Your grandmother sewed dignity into every stitch," he said. "These people buy theirs off the rack, and it still doesn't fit." He saw me and nodded once, slowly. I sat down on the other side of my grandmother and took her hand, and the 3 of us stayed in that garden while inside the house, $400,000 worth of anniversary party continued. Without noticing, we were gone. The 4th of July gathering was worse. Margaret introduced Abuela Lucia to the mayor as the woman who used to do our alterations. Isn't it sweet she still visits? Like my grandmother was a pet who had wandered back. Like her presence was a charming novelty rather than a response to an explicit invitation. I watched my grandmother smile through it. I watched the mayor nod politely and move on. I watched Margaret turn back to her conversation without registering that she had just reduced a 78-year-old woman's entire life to a footnote in the Pemberton family story. Then came the tennis tournament at the country club. Abuela Lucia drove her 15-year-old Camry from Tucson because I asked her to come, because I still believed that if Bennett's family just spent enough time with her, they would see what I saw. The valet took one look at her car and directed her to the overflow lot, 300 yards from the entrance, gravel instead of pavement. Bennett was standing 10 feet away. He heard the valet. He saw my grandmother's face. He looked at his phone. I said his name. He said, "They're probably just full up front, babe." They were not full up front. 3 spaces in the main lot were empty. I could see them from where we were standing. That night, after Abuela Lucia had gone back to Tucson and the house was quiet, I opened Bennett's phone to set an alarm because mine was dead. That is when I found the group text. Whitney had sent a voice clip of herself imitating my grandmother's accent, the way Abuela Lucia pronounced beautiful, with the stress on the wrong syllable. 3 laughing emojis from Whitney. A heart eyes emoji from a cousin I had met once. And from Bennett, my husband, the man who had said I was the best thing that ever happened to him. A laughing emoji and the words, "At least she's not staying overnight this time." I read it 3 times. My coffee went cold in my hands. My body understood before my mind caught up. I put his phone down in exactly the position I had found it, screen down on the nightstand, and I went to the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub and pressed my palms against my eyes until I saw colors that didn't exist. My spine knew what my heart refused to accept. The man I married thought my grandmother was a joke. Margaret removed me from the Pemberton Foundation Scholarship Committee the following month. She told the other donors I didn't quite understand our community's values. Our community, as if she owned the concept, as if values were real estate you could fence off and patrol. And then the thing that broke me open. Abuela Lucia fell in her kitchen in Tucson and broke her hip. She was 78 years old and alone on a tile floor for 40 minutes before her neighbor heard her calling out. I told Bennett we needed to cancel the ski trip to Aspen. He looked at me like I had suggested we cancel Christmas. "She's survived worse crossing the border," he said. I asked him to repeat that. He did. Same words. Same tone. Like surviving the most terrifying journey of my grandmother's life was evidence of her durability rather than her courage. I looked at him and I understood, with the clarity that comes only when love finally finishes dying, that he had never seen my family's struggles as sacrifices worth honoring. They were only material for punchlines. I went to Aspen alone in my mind. Some part of me left that marriage standing in our kitchen, hearing those words. But my body stayed. My body stayed because I needed time. Because 3 months earlier, I had overheard a phone call that had changed everything I understood about my husband's family, and I was not finished understanding it yet. Bennett had been on the back patio, speaking to his father in the voice he used when he thought I was asleep. Low, businesslike. The voice that had no warmth in it because warmth was a tool he deployed deliberately. He said something about the adjuster timeline on the Tahoe property. He mentioned coordination with the Sedona claim. He used the phrase pattern of loss, the way someone uses it when they are constructing one rather than discovering one. I am a senior insurance fraud investigator for a national carrier. I have spent 12 years learning to hear the difference between a person describing what happened to them and a person describing what they made happen. Bennett was describing architecture. He was describing a system. And my trained ear recognized it the way a musician recognizes a wrong note in a symphony. I did not investigate immediately. I waited 5 months. I waited because I needed to be sure, and I needed to be careful. and I needed to be so thoroughly, devastatingly correct that not a single person would be able to dismiss what I found. I ran the claims through my company's database on my personal time. I cross-referenced the Pemberton properties with reported losses going back 7 years. I found falsified insurance claims totaling $1.8 million in staged property damage across 3 vacation homes: the Tahoe House, the Sedona House, the property in Hilton Head, staged burglaries, inflated jewelry losses, coordinated damage reports filed across state lines to avoid pattern detection. And I found the video. Bennett's laptop, synced to a shared family cloud account he had forgotten I could access. A clip of Bennett coaching Whitney on how to age furniture before photographing it for claims. Sandpaper on a mahogany table, tea stains on upholstery, and Bennett laughing, saying, "Abuela doesn't know we're using her immigration story for sympathy with adjusters." My grandmother's border crossing, the most frightening experience of her life. They were using it as a prop in their fraud scheme, telling adjusters a story about a family matriarch's precious belongings destroyed, items that reminded her of the old country, to generate sympathy and inflate settlement values. They had turned my grandmother's pain into a revenue stream. I called Roberto Vega. I told him what I had found. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She deserved better than all of them." I asked him for access to the estate office, where Harrison kept financial records. Roberto hesitated. A long moment. Long enough that I heard him breathing and I thought he would say no. Then I heard keys. He met me at the service entrance at 6 in the morning and handed me a key and looked away. "The file cabinet's on the left wall," he said. "Top drawer." I found 7 years of coordinated paperwork. Receipts for furniture purchased specifically to be destroyed. Photographs taken in sequence showing damage being staged. Notes in Harrison's handwriting about which adjuster to target and when. Whitney Pemberton's wedding was 4 weeks away. 400 guests, the lieutenant governor, every family the Pembertons had ever impressed, employed, or intimidated, and a 12-foot projection screen rented for the wedding slideshow. I spent those 4 weeks building my evidence packet. If you're still listening, I need you to stay with me, because what happened next is the reason I'm telling you this story. I almost got caught. Bennett came home early on a Tuesday and found my laptop open on the insurance database. My heart stopped. He leaned over my shoulder. I said I was reviewing a work case. He nodded. He kissed the top of my head. He said, "You work too hard, babe." Then he walked into the kitchen and opened a beer. I sat there listening to the hiss of the can and the sound of my own blood in my ears, and I understood that his incuriosity about my life was the very thing that was going to make this possible. He never asked about my work because he never cared. Margaret sent Abuela Lucia a cashmere shawl after the hip surgery. The note said, "Healing surrounded by love." My grandmother held that shawl and said, "She remembered." I looked at the shawl and thought about Margaret's hands writing that note while her son used my grandmother's suffering to defraud insurance companies. The performance never stopped with these people. It was performance all the way down. The morning of Whitney's wedding, I put on a black dress my grandmother had altered for me. I took her sewing kit from my nightstand, where I had been keeping it, and put it in my clutch. I looked in the mirror, and I did not recognize the woman looking back. And that was the first time in months I felt like I was seeing myself clearly. I drove to the Pemberton estate. The October air smelled like sage and money. Valets were parking cars. Florists were arranging white roses. A string quartet was warming up on the terrace. I parked in the overflow lot. By choice this time. I walked 300 yards on gravel in heels, carrying a clutch that held a leather sewing kit, a USB drive, and the end of my marriage. The reception was beautiful in the way Pemberton events were always beautiful. Calculated and immaculate, 400 people in black tie, champagne towers, a raw bar that stretched 20 feet. I said hello to the lieutenant governor's wife. I complimented Whitney's dress. I told Margaret her centerpieces were stunning. I sat at my assigned table, which was not the family table, because Carmen never sat at the family table, and I ate a salad I could not taste, and I waited. Bennett came over once, kissed my cheek, said, "You look great tonight, babe," and went back to his groomsman duties. Margaret made a toast to Whitney and her new husband, and her voice cracked with emotion, and 400 people reached for their glasses, and I reached for mine, and I drank to the bride while the USB drive pressed against my thigh through the fabric of my grandmother's dress. The toasts continued. Harrison spoke about family legacy, about building something that endures, about values that you pass down like heirlooms. I listened to him talk about legacy while knowing that the legacy he had actually built was a 7-year insurance fraud operation that used my grandmother's suffering as a sympathy prop. The wedding slideshow played, baby pictures, childhood vacations, the Tahoe house, the Sedona house, the Hilton Head property. I watched photographs of the very houses they had staged burglaries in flash across the screen, while the room said, "Aw," and I pressed my fingernails into my palms until I felt the skin give. 4 weeks later, 400 people would watch everything change. That night, it was still just a slideshow, but the slideshow ended, and the DJ announced the microphone was open for additional toasts. And this is the part where my hands stopped shaking. I had expected to be terrified. Instead, what I felt was the absence of fear. What I felt was the specific calm that comes when you have been carrying something so heavy for so long that the act of setting it down feels inevitable rather than brave. I stood up. I walked to the stage. I heard my heels on the wooden floor, and it sounded like counting. Bennett saw me approach the microphone and smiled. He thought I was giving a toast. Margaret turned to the woman beside her and said something that made them both laugh. The room settled into the comfortable attention of people expecting to hear something pleasant. I plugged the USB drive into the projection system. I said, "I want to talk about what the Pemberton family has really built." The first document appeared on the screen. A falsified insurance claim on the Tahoe property, $740,000. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when they sense something has broken. Not silent yet. Just the leading edge of silence. I walked them through it. Claim by claim. Property by property. I used my professional voice, the one I use in depositions, clear and factual and absolutely without mercy. I showed the photographs of staged damage. I showed the receipts for furniture purchased to be destroyed. I showed the pattern across state lines that I had identified using the same methodology I used in my day job, because I am very, very good at my day job. Margaret's face went white, not gradually, all at once, like someone had pulled a plug. Harrison reached for his scotch glass and his hand closed on air. Bennett stood up from his chair and then sat back down and then stood up again, and his mouth opened and closed without sound. And for the first time in our marriage, I saw the real Bennett Pemberton Shaw, the one who had no script for this moment. Then I played the video. Bennett's voice filled the ballroom, his own voice, laughing, coaching Whitney on aging furniture, and then the sentence that detonated the room. "Abuela doesn't know we're using her immigration story for sympathy with adjusters." The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of 400 people understanding simultaneously that everything they had believed about this family was a construction. I watched the room. I could not help it. The lieutenant governor's wife set down her champagne glass with exaggerated care, as if she were handling something that had become contaminated. A woman at table 6, a museum board member I recognized from Margaret's fundraisers, put her hand over her mouth and then took it away and then put it back. Bennett's college roommate, A man who had given a toast 20 minutes earlier about brotherhood and loyalty was staring at the tablecloth like it contained instructions for what to do next. Whitney's new husband looked at Whitney, and Whitney looked at the floor, and neither of them looked at each other again for the rest of the night. And then, Roberto Vega stood up. He was at a staff table near the kitchen entrance, because Roberto had always been near the service entrance, just like my grandmother. He stood, and he said, in a voice that carried across that silent ballroom, "I worked for this family for 22 years. I watched them treat good people like props. Every word she just said is true." The room exhaled, not all at once, in pieces. A murmur here, a chair pushed back there. The lieutenant governor leaned over and whispered to an aide who immediately began typing on his phone. Margaret tried to speak. She stood and opened her mouth and said, "This is completely," and then stopped, because 400 people were looking at her with the expression that people get when they have just been shown the difference between what they were told and what was real, and there is no sentence in any language that recovers from that expression. Harrison did not stand. Harrison sat very still and looked at his hands, and I realized he was calculating. Even now, even in this moment, he was running numbers, assessing damage, trying to find the angle. It was the most honest thing I had ever seen him do. I turned off the projection. I looked at Bennett. He was standing in the middle of the dance floor, which was absurd, and he was crying, which surprised me, and he said my name once, "Carmen," and I felt nothing. I took the USB drive. I put it in my clutch, next to my grandmother's sewing kit. I walked off the stage and through the ballroom and past the valet stand and across 300 yards of gravel in heels, and I drove home with the windows down, and the October air tasted like the first breath after being underwater. The FBI moved faster than I expected, coordinated with state insurance commissioners across 3 jurisdictions within a month. The Pemberton Foundation lost its nonprofit status by the end of the quarter. The Arizona Republic ran a 6-part investigation that revealed connections between the Pemberton's business interests and 2 state legislators who had received foundation donations. Margaret resigned from the Phoenix Art Museum board before the criminal referrals were finalized. She tried to frame it as a sabbatical. The museum accepted her resignation without comment, which is the polite version of changing the locks. The country club membership lapsed when dues went unpaid, because it turns out that when your assets are frozen pending a federal investigation, the tennis courts become somebody else's problem. But the part that I carry, the part that lives in my chest, is what happened in the weeks after. The phone calls from people who had been at the wedding. Not all of them were kind. Some were furious at me for ruining the evening, but most were something else. A woman named Patricia, who had served on the foundation board, called me and said, "I always felt something was off with that family. I just didn't have the words." "You had the words, Patricia. You just didn't have the proof. And that is the difference." A man who had done business with Harrison for 15 years sent me an email that said only, "Thank you." The invitation stopped coming for the Pembertons. The holiday party was canceled. The New Year's gala was canceled. The phone calls that Margaret used to make, the ones where she organized and delegated and controlled the social calendar of an entire community, those calls stopped being returned. The cashmere shawl she had sent my grandmother sat in a box in my closet for 2 weeks before I donated it to a shelter. My grandmother did not need Margaret Pemberton's idea of love. Bennett called me 11 times the day after the wedding. I answered on the 12th call because I wanted to hear what he would say. He said I had destroyed his family. He said I had destroyed our marriage. He said I was vindictive and ungrateful. He did not say I was wrong. That was the most honest conversation we ever had. If you are carrying the truth about someone the world admires and you are afraid of what will happen when you speak, I need you to hear me. I stood in a ballroom full of people who loved the Pembertons, and I told the truth, and the sky did not fall. The sky is still up there. What fell was a facade, and facades are supposed to fall. They are not structures. They are decorations on structures that were never sound. 6 months have passed. My daughter Sophia is 5 years old, and she sits at my grandmother's kitchen table in the small house in Tucson and watches Abuela Lucia thread a needle with hands that have been threading needles for nearly 70 years. The leather sewing kit sits between them, open, the brass thimble catching the afternoon light. Sophia holds the thimble while her great-grandmother shows her how to make the first stitch, the one that anchors everything that follows. My grandmother's hands are slower now since the hip. But they remember. They remember every stitch in every dress for every family that hired her and underpaid her and never invited her to sit down. They remember Margaret Pemberton's wedding dress. They remember the serving tray at the anniversary party. And they remember, because hands always remember, the work that outlasts the people who tried to diminish it. Sophia will grow up knowing that her family's hands built more than the Pembertons ever purchased. She will grow up knowing the difference between a legacy that is constructed for display and one that is sewn into the fabric of who you are. Here is what I learned and what I need you to know. The dynamic I lived inside has a name. It is called public persona abuse, and it is one of the most isolating forms of mistreatment that exists. Research shows that 72% of people who experience emotional abuse from a publicly admired individual report that the community's positive perception of their abuser was itself a barrier to seeking help. They could not be believed because the performance was too convincing. And a study published in the Journal of Family Psychology found that in families where financial fraud is present, 81% of the time at least one family member was aware of irregularities, but remained silent due to fear of social consequences. The silence is not cowardice. It is a calculation made under pressure by people who understand that the social cost of truth can feel more dangerous than the truth itself. But the cost of silence is higher. The cost of silence is your grandmother carrying a serving tray at a party she was invited to as a guest. The cost of silence is your wedding photos in the basement. The cost of silence is your family's story reduced to a tool in someone else's fraud scheme. If someone you love is being diminished by someone the world admires, the proof matters. Gather it. Keep it. And when the moment comes, and it will come, because people who perform eventually need an audience, and you will be standing in that audience with the truth in your hands, you will know what to do. Tell me where you are listening from right now. Tell me if you have ever sat in a room and smiled at someone who hurt you because everyone around you thought they were wonderful. Tell me what you would have done standing at that microphone. Subscribe if this story reminded you that the truth does not need to be loud. It just needs to be said in a room where people can hear it. And share this with someone who needs to know that their grandmother, their mother, their family was always the gift, even when the people receiving it never deserved it.